We are in Santa Cruz and we're about to head to Aptos, which is about 15 minutes down the road. We're going to Ed Kemper's former house and then a hangout spot where he would go and talk to police about the co-ed killer case. On the way over, I'll give you some background. Now, Kemper is fascinating to me because if you've ever watched any of his interviews, he comes across as incredibly self-aware and intelligent. And during the course of the investigation, police said that they found themselves liking the guy, which just makes him more dangerous and his crimes even more disturbing. The things that he did to his victims are so hard to comprehend and beyond evil. I've talked about Ted Bundy on this channel and how he was an organized killer. Well, Ed Kemper makes Bundy look disorganized. When we look at Kemper's childhood, it's both sad and disturbing. He was the middle child and only boy in the family. His parents had separated when he was around 9 and divorced 4 years later, which left Ed devastated. He had been close to his father, but the relationship that he had with his mother, Clarnell, was dysfunctional, to say the least. After the separation, he lived with his mother and sisters. Now, Clarnell was an alcoholic who was domineering and would frequently belittle and humiliate him. And as a child, I think Kemper didn't really feel like he fit in because of his size. When he was born, he was an unusually large baby, and as he got older, he was much larger than children his age. By 15, Kemper was 6'4", and as an adult, he stood 6'9", and weighed around 280 pounds. Clarnell would make fun of her son for how he looked, and she would often tell him that he reminded her of his father. She also regularly told him that no woman would ever love him, and she didn't really show him any affection at all, because according to reports, she thought that it would turn him gay. There were many nights that Ed slept in a locked basement because Clarnell was worried that he would hurt his sisters. Interestingly, as a child, Kemper had some near-death experiences. It's been said that his older sister once tried to push him in front of a train, and then on another occasion, she pushed him into a pool where he almost drowned. While all of these things are sad for a child to go through, Kemper was also exhibiting some really disturbing behavior when he was young. There were instances of animal cruelty as well as voyeurism. He would take his younger sister's dolls and remove their heads and hands, which is something we would see repeated years later with his victims. Shortly after his parents' divorce was final, he ran away from home at age 14. At that time, he had been living in Helena, Montana, with his mother and sisters. He left Montana and went to his dad's house in Van Nuys, California. He discovered that his dad had remarried and had a stepson, so he stayed there for a short period of time, and then his dad decided that it would be best if he went to go live with his paternal grandparents, and they lived about 250 miles away near North Fork, California. And this is where Ed's story takes an even darker turn. Now, Ed quickly discovered that his grandmother, Maud, was very similar to his mother, and he described her as, quote, constantly emasculating me and my grandfather, end quote. On August 27, 1964, Kemper got into an argument with her as they were sitting at the kitchen table. Well, he was upset. He got up from the table, and then he went to go get a rifle that his grandfather had given him for hunting. He came back into the kitchen and shot Maud in the head and back. His grandfather had been at the grocery store during all this, and when he came home, Ed went outside to meet him in the driveway and shot him as well. He later said that he didn't want him to see what he had done to his wife, and that he knew he would be upset, obviously. Afterwards, he called his mother and he told her what happened, and she told him, well, call the police. so he did. And he was taken into custody without incident. And shortly after that, he said that he, quote, just wanted to see what it felt like to kill grandma, end quote. A court psychiatrist diagnosed Kemper with paranoid schizophrenia and sent him to Atascadero State Hospital. Now, Atascadero is a maximum security prison, but also a psychiatric hospital for offenders. While he was there, the psychiatrist determined that he did not have paranoid schizophrenia. They observed him as being highly intelligent and introspective. In fact, they administered 2 IQ tests on him while he was there. The first resulted in 136, and the second came back as 145. So for perspective, only 2% of the population has an IQ over 140, and it's considered to be genius level of intelligence. Now, while Kemper was there, he was a model prisoner. He was even trained to administer psychiatric tests on other inmates, which he excelled at, and that to me is just insane. But this would prove to be a classroom for him. After his final arrest, he said that learning how these kinds of tests worked allowed him to completely manipulate his psychiatrist. After spending about 6 years at that facility, Kemper was released on parole in 1969. He was 21 years old at the time, and all of his doctors said that he should not be released into the care of his mother. But that is exactly where Ed ended up going, and after only 3 years of parole, he was deemed rehabilitated and his juvenile records were expunged. But to back up a little bit, by the time that Ed was released, his mother had remarried. She was now known as Clarnell Strandberg. The marriage didn't last, and after her divorce, she moved to Aptos, California for a fresh start. She had gotten a job as an administrative assistant at the University of California in Santa Cruz, and that will be important later. When Ed first moved back home, he tried to get a job as a police officer, but he was rejected due to his size. He befriended the local officers, though, and he maintained a casual friendship with them up until his arrest, and that will also be important to remember later. He ended up working a few jobs here and there before finally landing in a position with the Department of Transportation. Now, I should also point out that the unhealthy dynamic that Ed had with his mother in his earlier years pretty much started up as soon as he moved back in. Ed saved his money, moved to Alameda in hopes of getting away from her, but according to him, she kept calling and showing up to his house unannounced. He often struggled financially, and he would find himself back at his mother's house in Aptos, where we are now. This house here is where Ed Kemper lived with his mother. The apartment was here on the bottom floor, number 609A. I'm not going to linger too much here because there's been a lot of activity and I don't want to make anybody uncomfortable by standing out here and filming. I'll put in some clips of what it looked like back in 1973. When Ed began his killing spree in 1972, he was living in Alameda, and this was the apartment complex that he lived in. He had purchased this Ford Galaxy with money that he had gotten from a lawsuit that he won after being hit by a car on his motorcycle. At that time, he had noticed that a lot of women hitchhiked, which was pretty normal back then. According to his interviews, Kemper later said that he began killing co-eds because he was frustrated with feeling unable to communicate socially and sexually with them. He expressed that he was scared to death of failing in male/female relationships, and he asked his mother to introduce him to some of the students at UC Santa Cruz, but she refused. She would often make comments to him about how the girls were too good for Ed and that he didn't deserve to get to know them at all. So as a way to develop friendships and get comfortable interacting with women, he began picking them up when they were hitchhiking. And according to him, he did this over 100 times without hurting anyone, but he couldn't shake the dark fantasies that he had about killing them. And over time, he would do things to escalate the situation, like bring a weapon but not reveal it, or drive a different way to a less populated area to see how they would respond. On May 7th, 1972, while driving in Berkeley, Kemper decided to take things to the next level. He picked up two students, Mary Ann Pesci and Anita Mary Lucchesa from Fresno State University, under the pretense of driving them to Stanford University. And after driving to a secluded area, he stabbed and strangled both young women. He placed them both in his trunk, and he was actually stopped by police for a broken taillight on his way back to his apartment. But the officer did not suspect that the man they had just pulled over had two dead women in his trunk, so the officer let him go. He ended up bringing his victims back to his apartment in Alameda, and I guess the best way to describe it is that he used them to satisfy his dark, twisted, sick fantasies. He then dismembered them and dumped them in a remote area near Loma Prieta Mountain. And this is a pattern that Kemper would follow for his next 4 victims. 4 months later, after missing her bus to get to her dance class, an unsuspecting 15-year-old Aiko Ku accepted a ride from Kemper. And like his previous victims, he drove her to a remote area. This time, though, he locked himself outside of the car and convinced her to let him back inside. And when she did, she met the same fate as Mary Ann Pesci and Anita Mary Lucchesa. But after putting her in his trunk to bring back to his apartment, he stopped at a local bar to have a few drinks, which is, again, insane. He later stated in interviews that after leaving the bar, he opened the trunk in the parking lot, admiring his catch like a fisherman. 4 months later, back in Aptos, Kemper found his 4th co-ed victim while driving around Cabrillo College. And at this point, he had moved back in with his mother. He picked up 18-year-old Cindy Shaw on campus, and then he drove her to a wooded area and fatally shot her with a .22 caliber pistol. He brought her back to his mother's apartment and kept her in his closet overnight. Like the others, he continued to do the most horrific things to her. In the case of Cindy, after he severed her head, he buried it in the backyard in the garden, facing his mother's bedroom. He then threw the rest of her body off a cliff. This area right here at the end of the driveway is where the garden was and where her head was buried. About a month later, after an argument with his mother, Kemper began to search for his next victims. And at this point, universities were concerned that there was in fact a serial killer that was targeting students, so they added more buses to their schedule to discourage hitchhiking. And they told students if they do hitchhike, only accept rides from drivers with a university sticker on the car. And like I mentioned earlier, Kemper's mother worked at UCSC, so he was easily able to get a sticker. In an interview, Kemper said that in the beginning, when people were on high alert on campus, if he picked someone up and they started talking about the murders, they were getting a free ride and he would not kill them. But on February 5th, 1973, he picked up two young women separately. First was 23-year-old Rosalind Thorpe. She got into his front seat after leaving a lecture, and shortly after, while Rosalind was still alive, they encountered 20-year-old Allison Liu. Allison got into the back seat, and after driving around a little bit, Kemper shot Rosalind, and then he turned the gun on Allison. And like all the other women, he brought their bodies back to his mother's apartment. In the same interview, Kemper said that he remained undetectable, and because of that, he began to flaunt that invisibility that he felt. He stated that when he brought Rosalind and Allison back to his mother's apartment, he severed their heads in the driveway at 11 o'clock at night. His mother was home as well as his neighbor, and he said that he could have easily been seen by his neighbor if they had just looked out the window. Now, remember when I said earlier that Ed befriended the local police after he was rejected from joining the force? Well, during the investigation, Ed came here to the jury room to have drinks regularly. And this was a local hangout spot for police, and they all knew Ed. He described himself as a friendly nuisance to the officers. In interviews, he said that he didn't often bring up the case because he thought it would draw suspicion, but he did talk with them about it and observed what was being said to see if he could find out what they knew about the murders. Just over 2 months later, Kemper decided that he was done killing co-eds. He was going to kill his mother, Clarnell. And when she came home drunk from a party, he woke up and walked into her room while she was reading in bed. And when she saw him, he said that she looked at him and said, "I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now." He said no and wished her a good night. And after she fell asleep, he came back to her room and, for lack of a better way of describing it, viciously attacked and mutilated her. Then he hid her body in the closet and again went to a nearby bar to have some drinks. When he came home, he invited his mother's 59-year-old friend Sally Hallett over for dinner and to watch a movie. Now, thinking she was going to spend time with Clarnell and her son, Sally made her way over to the apartment, only to be strangled shortly after entering the home. And to make it look like his mother wasn't home, he moved her car to a nearby street. Kemper then fled to Pueblo, Colorado, and he was convinced that police would be looking for him. And when he realized that they weren't, he called the police from a payphone at this intersection here and confessed to killing his mother and her friend. Ironically, when Ed called, they thought he was messing around and told him to call back later. So he did. A few hours later, he spoke to an officer that he personally knew and waited where he was for the police to arrest him. Once in custody, he also confessed to murdering the 6 college students.
He was an average person. He blended in with everybody. I mean, he talked a lot. When we had a barbecue down here in the backyard last July, but the only time he didn't talk too much is when, like, if I'd meet him in the garage by myself, or he was coming in and I was going out, or the other way around. All he would say is hi, and that was it. But if you tried to start a conversation with him, it was kind of useless. You know, he never really volunteered anything. So.
How do you feel now that you found out he was a neighbor?
Scared still, because he really was a neighbor. I lived right next door in the next apartment next to him. And just gives me the creeps is kind of an understatement.
Oh, he was kind of an odd man, and he didn't say much. He seemed like kind of a mama's boy. I always was kind of afraid of him, actually. He scared me a lot, and I heard him and his mother argue quite a bit, all the time.
The following month, Kemper was indicted on 8 counts of first-degree murder. On November 8th, 1973, a jury found him sane and guilty on all accounts. He asked for the death penalty, requesting death by torture, but because a moratorium was placed on capital punishment, Kemper received 7 years to life for each count. Just like his previous incarceration, Kemper has been a model prisoner. He's done numerous interviews and has stated that he's participated because he hopes to save others like himself from killing. He's also worked with the FBI to help them understand how serial killers operate. And given his personality, I can see how his ego would just totally enjoy that. Kemper was also a subject of season 1 of Mindhunter. And up until his stroke in 2015, he narrated over 5,000 hours of audiobooks, which just feels kind of creepy to me. Kemper first became eligible for parole in 1979. At his parole hearing in 1988, he said, quote, "Society is not ready in any shape or form for me. I can't fault them for that," end quote. He was last up for parole in 2024, and his next hearing will be in 2031. And even though he's now wheelchair-bound, has diabetes and coronary heart disease, a psychiatric evaluation done in April of 2024 determined that he is at high risk to reoffend if released. I know in this video I didn't go into every single detail of this case, and there is so much out there about Kemper. But as I was researching this, I came across a website that had incredible documentation of the case called EdmundKemperStories.com. It is the most comprehensive and organized site that I have found on Kemper. I will link it below if you want to check it out. But that is going to do it for this video. Let me know what you think of Ed Kemper in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.